So for now, let me introduce my dear friend, Robin Yap. You know, when you're doing volunteer work, like PATA, right? We don't get paid, we are just volunteers. You need to have someone in your team that you can count on when you need help. And I'm indeed grateful to have such a person in my team, in Robin Yap. Now, I'm not going to go through the CV of Robin. For those who know Robin, because it's just going to take too long. It probably take an hour or so. You can follow him on Facebook, or for those fans of his, you can go to his website, onerobin.com. Now, Robin is an unique individual. I guarantee you that. So please help me welcome on stage PBM, BBM, Mentor of the Year, and Chairman Emeritus, the Travel Corporation Asia, the one and only Dr. Robin Yap.
Thank you, Sun Hua. In other words, a guy that can be easily arrowed, right? Despite the fact that my luggage is there and I'm flying off at 2 o'clock, he doesn't let me go. But that's what tourism industry is all about. It's about willingness to step out and to play a little role, and perhaps together we can do our parts to bring people together, have a meaningful discussion so that we have right information. And at this juncture, you know, when you wake up in the morning, apart from reading your mainstream media, your social media news, and then the 25,000 forwarded messages from all your friends about when are they banning the PMDs. And then yesterday I have 35,000 people telling me that, oh good, you can now walk safely on the path without being run down by the PMDs. But all this add to confusion because we don't know which one to read. And when you read too much, you're confused. There's one gentleman that I've got the privilege and honor to know that one day I got a call from the Economist, and then he says, there's this gentleman called Andrew Staples would like to meet you. And then you work for European companies, when you hear Ang Mo name, you stand up, you say, oh my God, who is going to talk to me now? And Andrew came to my office, and he was very fortunate that I met him because when I fly with my owner of the group, the Travel Corporation owner, he will read every single page of The Economist on flight. You don't get to sleep even in 12 hours. And then he will put that little corner or circle a few words. Hey, Robin, did you read this? Did you read that? And you better know and better say yes. And thank goodness I met Andrew, because I now follow whatever he says on Instagram and everything else, so I can answer politically correctly to my bosses. And that's why I keep my job. Ladies and gentlemen, we now like to invite Mr. Andrew Staples, the Global Editorial Director of the Economist Corporate Network and EIU, to run you through and give you a scan of somebody who has been, I don't think he ever sleep. But before we go into that, there is 2 slides on the wall, because I mentioned earlier we want to have an engagement. And the engagement means Singapore audience sometimes don't want to stand up and give a statement or ask a question. So we have the Slido, and then you can either use the QR code to scan, and then you log in, you bring you straight in there, so that you can pose your questions. And before we go into the discussion proper, we're going to pop up 2 questions, so that we will have before and after. The before is right now. You are still raw, and you're still reading all the confusing news, and you may have a different view about what the world will be. But after the analysis and what Andrew will reassure us after his presentation, maybe you have a different view. So we have a before view and an after view after his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew Staples. Thank you. Okay, now I think Sun Hua wants it now. Before Andrew speaks, let's lock in now. And how much does the current US-USA tension and the Hong Kong situation impact your business? So we want to get a feel of how you feel now. All right, so we will see the numbers coming up, 25%, 29%. wow, this is very serious. Moderate. I'm glad that, we guys are quite cool about it in the tourism business. So what, tomorrow is another day. So it's quite moderate. It's quite nice. Okay, so you have 27. You've got some serious stuff, 18% minimum. No impact at all. That's nice. Some of you don't worry about all this. Get on with life. So if we can see 40, we're trying to move. We've now got about 200 guests in the audience. So if you can give us your current state of mind, how you feel right now, that will give us an indication of, hopefully after what Andrew has presented, you will have a different view. How come okay, so you get moderate impact, you get 55. Can we have more? Do you have any problem? On your table, you have your Wi-Fi logged in, so that there is an instruction on your table, very kindly placed there by the One Farah Hotel, so that you can use your Wi-Fi to do it. Okay. So we'll try to move it up. So you have 67. We've got there. Okay, I think, Sunhua, we should be able to do it. So the next question we're going to post up, so that will give you a second feel of what the next question will be. If you go to next question, how do you expect 2020 to be compared to 2019? Well, as what Sunhua said, we don't even know what happened tomorrow when you wake up and you're trying to forecast 2020. So that will give you, hopefully by the end of this, your views might change. Wow, this question seems to be more, connecting with you, and you can see the votes are coming in quite fast. Okay, I'm glad that.
Yeah, voting is secret. Don't worry, okay? This is not
your
general
name will not be
elections.
submitted to PDPA or whatever. You'll be quite secret. But if you want to put your name up there, that's fine. Sorry? Hang on. This is the QR, so you just scan it. Okay? Just in case you missed it earlier. Okay, you just have to scan it with your QR scanner, and it will bring you straight to the page. Okay. Guess we are all done. Okay. Okay, the next. Okay, now we've got to 72. I think that's quite good an indicator of what your current state of mind is. And now I would like to hand over to Andrew, who will take us in your presentation. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and Sukhwar as well. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today. My name is Andy Staples. I'm the editorial director of something called the Economist Corporate Network. I'm based here in Singapore, have been for the last 4 years or so, previously a long time in Japan. You're the experts in tourism, hospitality and so on. I'm not, but I'm here to talk about the economy, politics and how we see Asia Pacific over the next few years. I've got some slides to go through. Don't worry, I'll keep them nice and visual. There might be a couple of charts in there, because that's what we do at The Economist. But let me just sort of introduce who we are and what we do. Hopefully, Robin was talking about the Economist publication a little bit earlier on. How many people are subscribers to The Economist in the room? Hopefully we'll get a few more at the end of the session. I don't get any commission, but I do strongly recommend that you take The Economist. We were established 176 years ago to argue for free trade, liberalism, economic growth, transparency, democracy, all those great things that hopefully everybody in the room subscribe to as well. And I think now, more than ever, if you look at what's going on around the world, it's very important to get yourself aware of some of these conversations. What's the future of capitalism? How is technology reshaping our societies? What's going on with globalization? What about all of this populist or nationalist pushback against globalization and so on? These are the type of the themes that we look at. Generally, with the Economist Group, we have the media business over here with the publication, a weekly publication. There's a whole events business around that as well, and thought leadership. And the other side of the business is the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is the research arm. So we do in-depth studies, reporting, analysis of countries, all the countries around the world. We publish regular reports on politics, economics, our economic forecasts, risk, and so on and so forth. So that's a part of the business that I'm in. However, much more interestingly, I run the Economist Corporate Network, which is the interface between the Economist Group and the corporate world. So, for example, Travel Corporation, we're delighted to have as members of our network. We put together a program of events, of briefings, to help our members get a deeper, more holistic understanding of what's going on in the world. Here in Singapore, our network, we have about 100 members, mainly big corporates, and it would be the Asia-Pacific heads, I suppose, of those corporates who come along to our meetings to look at everything that's going on, politics, economics, what does that mean for strategy, how is automation going to change the business environment over the next 5 years. These type of issues are what we're looking at. Our networks are predominantly in Asia, so, emerging nations. We do have a strong network in Japan, which is not an emerging economy, but it's a very challenging and rewarding economy there. So, we're very much there to help our members understand what's going on. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more, there's the website there. Please do go and have a look, or come and talk to me at the end of the session. Okay, so that's that out the way. Let me come on then to some of the things that we are really interested in and wanted to share with you this morning over the next 10, 15 minutes or so, and then we get into a bit of a conversation as well. One of the biggest issues that we see sort of shaping the global economy at the moment is this issue around geopolitical risk, which has been on the rise for a few years now. I'm very lucky to work for The Economist because I get to use these covers to illustrate what I'm talking about. And this is a cover just from a couple of months ago, talking about the age of anxiety. And you heard earlier on from Suhua about VUCA. Well, these are things that are very familiar to us as well. On the one hand, economic growth financial markets in places like the United States are doing pretty well, record levels for the S&P and so on. Unemployment is at multi-decade lows. Monetary policy is very accommodative. In other words, interest rates are virtually at zero in most advanced economies around the world. So all of this should be spurring economic growth. On the other hand, there's a lot of uncertainty around the world. And let me talk you through where we think some of that is coming from. In particular, it's coming from President Trump. And I think over the past few years, we've seen President Trump take this wrecking ball to some of the infrastructure of the global economy that we've grown up with over many decades. You could go right the way back to the end of the Second World War, but more particularly sort of from the 80s and 90s onwards. And I'm thinking of globalization, of things like the World Trade Organization, reducing barriers to trade, stimulating global value chains, supply chains, and so on. The rise of economies here within Asia, stitching together a proper global economy. But a lot of those certainties, a lot of those expectations are now being challenged by President Trump. It might be challenging trading relationships with China, which I'll come on to in a moment. It might be challenging or questioning the relationship with Europe through NATO, the security alliance there. Or anywhere we look around the world, we see President Trump really shaking up the global economy. And this creates a lot of uncertainty. This creates a lot of unease. The idea that you have this global economy and America is the sort of central power within all that, quietly supporting things like the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, all of those infrastructure, all of that infrastructure of the global economy, all of that is being questioned now. This is the cover just from a couple of weeks. You see this really coming into focus if you're familiar with what's going on in Syria. And just a couple of weeks ago, President Trump unilaterally announced he was going to pull his troops out. This creates a power vacuum. He's been working there with the Kurds for many years. They feel that they've been left high and dry. Russia moves straight into that power vacuum that we have there. And this is taking place all over the world. So again, this is creating a lot of uncertainty and dislocation. One of the biggest areas that we see, though, of course, is around trade. And since late 2017, I suppose, we've been very, very concerned about what's happening with global trade. And global trade this year will be posting some of its lowest growth that we've seen in the past 11, 12 years or so since the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. That's really impacting economies here within the region, not least Singapore. Very open economy, lots of trade coming through in and out. But this big trade war that we've got going on with China is a massive headwind for the global economy. And I'll come back to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Part of all of this is this relationship, this understanding that places like America, maybe the rest of the world, have had about China. And if you go back to China's opening up, late 70s through the 1980s, but really turbocharged when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, then we really see that double-digit growth that's made China the world's second largest economy and an increasingly rich consumer economy as well. But the narrative has always been that as China gets more integrated with the global economy, its people will get more invested in democracy, its government will be more interested in the rule of law rather than the rule of the Communist Party, and China will become another sort of liberal, open market economy. That thesis is now in the waste paper basket. It's thrown out of the window, particularly because of Xi Jinping and the direction that he's taking the mainland Chinese economy. And this has really brought it into tension with the United States, and that's come right up together with the trade war that we see now. And let's be clear, the trade war is not just about China buying some more soya beans or America buying more T-shirts or whatever it is. It's fundamentally about leadership of the global economy between these two powers. America is the preeminent power at the moment, China as the emerging superpower as well. There's a lot of tension there, and we particularly see this coming through in areas like technology. Who's going to be building your 5G system? Is it going to be Huawei, which America has banned from building its infrastructure because of fears that it's linked to the military, to the Chinese Communist Party? Or will it be a Western counterpart? And we could see that the world splits into two sort of competing technological worlds. And with this, again, is one of those headwinds, one of those uncertainties for the global economy. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, so the organization that regulates trade around the world at the moment and has done so much to promote globalization and all of the growth that we've seen, is under massive threat. Next month, if we don't have the appointment of 2 new judges to its dispute resolution court, the WTO will essentially cease to function. And this is not good for the global economy. It will slow down trade. It will mean more and more disputes and conflicts won't be resolved. At the same time, we've had things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Singapore is a member of, has been signed. That's very, very positive. Just this week, we've had progress on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which is ASEAN, India, China, some other economies as well, covering about half of global GDP. These are very positive moves, but they're not there yet. And it's not a multilateral effort as well, so suboptimal. We could also be thinking about other sources of uncertainty, what's going on in Iran. And again, you can trace this back to President Trump taking America out of that deal that was signed with the European Union, with Russia, to try to put a cap on Iran's nuclear ambitions. You see all the dislocation in the Middle East. We just recently had attacks on the Saudi oil fields by Iranian-backed rebels, if not by Iran itself. All of this creating a lot of tension and uncertainty in the world. Closer to home, we can think about what's going on in Hong Kong. And again, that goes back to this thesis about where is China itself going? And 20 years ago, 10 years ago, it would have been, when is China going to catch up to Hong Kong in terms of democratic rights and so on? And now it's more a case of, will Hong Kong survive? These demonstrations over the past few months or so have really had an immediate impact on the economy. We did some research just earlier in the week. Hong Kong is now technically in recession. We've had 2 negative quarters of growth in that economy. Tourism is taking a huge hit, I think just over a drop of 34% or so in tourist numbers month on month. So this is having a really serious impact here and now. It's the longer-term impact on that economy that we're much more interested in. A lot of the discussions that we're hearing from our members is about how much of our head office operations do we want in Hong Kong? How much should we be looking to relocate to places like Singapore, perhaps Kuala Lumpur, and so on? What's the role of Hong Kong today? Because it's very different from what it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And is it needed by Beijing anymore? The growth of that Greater Bay Area with the growing importance of places like Shanghai. So, real existential issues for Hong Kong. And of course, I'm from the UK. I don't want to talk about this anymore if you can possibly avoid it. But this is another example of that type of dislocation that's going on. And interesting to think, both the United States and Britain, sort of standard barriers for globalization, both sort of turning inwards. America first, and Britain coming out of the richest consumer single market in the world as well. Very complicated picture there. We're going to have a general election on December the 12th. Very interesting to see what happens there. It's not a slam dunk that Brexit will happen. There are a number of different scenarios. Very difficult for us to call what's going on there. All of this, though, adding to that sort of geopolitical uncertainty, which translates into economic headwinds for the global economy. And I'll come on to growth forecasts in a moment. But just to give you an example of all of that, this is a really interesting study. So some academics, I think it was at Stanford, analysed all of our research, all of our country reports, and where we saw uncertainty, or this word uncertainty, in front of anything related to trade, then they tracked that. And this is looking at the sort of trade uncertainty index for China, Canada, United States, core economies there. And look how that spikes just in recent years. That's the trade war. And what does that mean? Well, that means if I'm an American company doing business in China, do I need to relocate my factory elsewhere? And the answer for many people is yes. If I'm a Chinese company trying to do business in Europe or the United States, am I going to get approval for my investment? And so all of this, again, creating headwinds for the global economy. The other sort of more secular issue, so these are things that are going on, trade wars, military tension in the Middle East, Hong Kong, and all the rest of it. The other thing that's going on in the background, sort of playing in the background, is this idea of globalization. That the global economy is actually sort of downshifted, and particularly in the 10 years, again, since the global financial crisis, which, for anybody who wasn't around at that time, was a bad thing that happened, and we're still sort of living in the aftermath of all of this. And I'll just put this one up here. This is we did a study earlier in the year. These are all sort of measures of globalization. So the amount of money that's flowing across the world, the amount of money that foreign companies are investing in a different country, the amount of trade that's taking place, particularly intermediate goods, so components that are made in one country go to another country to make a final product, and so on. All of these are measures of globalization. On all of those measures, the global economy is slowing down. Whether it's trade, investment, and so on, we see that downshift there. More interestingly, I think much more relevant to you guys here, is if you start looking at this measure down at the bottom here, so we're looking at international parcel volume, so that's e-commerce. If we're thinking about movement of people, if we're thinking about the movement of data, which is massively increasing, and if we're talking about international air travel, on all of these measures, we see a much different story. So this sort of leads us to think about, well, actually, how are we looking at the global economy? Should we forget about things like container ships and so on and focus more on the new economy? But anyway, these are some issues that I think we need to keep in mind about where the global economy is going. So I just talked about some of the sort of top-level themes that animate us, that we're concerned about, that we talk about with our members. We also sort of talk about it in terms of, well, what does it mean for your strategy? How are you positioning for all of this? We also publish our risks. I'll come on to our economic forecast in a moment, but we also publish our sort of top 10 risks to the global economy that we see every month. And let me just put this one up for you. I'll just talk you through. So over here, you'll see some numbers. We have a risk scale going from 0 up to 25. And we look at risk in terms of how likely is this scenario to happen? And if this scenario happened, how big an impact would it have? So those two measures, we put them together. There's lots of different things that go into it, and it spits out a score. So basically down here, 5, a major military confrontation takes place on the Korean Peninsula. we don't think is going to happen. We think there's a very, very low likelihood of that. It's an ever-present danger. We've got Mr. Kim lobbing his missiles about, and we've got lots of tension there in America, carrier groups and all the rest of it, but we think it's highly unlikely that anything is going to happen there. However, as you come up the risk level up here, right at the top, nearly at the top score, so that's a score of 20, we think that this US-China trade war, one of the biggest risks to the global economy is splitting the global economy into competing spheres of influence. And if you were to look at this list about 2 years ago, right at the top there, we had the risk of a US-China trade war breaking out. And of course, that happened, so that risk scenario comes into our forecasts, but this is what we think could happen to the global economy. And look how many sort of trade-related issues are in there. You know, are we going to see the trade war morph into some kind of currency war? Just a few weeks ago, when the RMB went below 7 to the US dollar, the United States labeled China a currency manipulator. The European Central Bank, just last month or the month before, announced that it was going to cut interest rates, it was going to ease monetary policy again, which meant that the euro went down in value, which made President Trump very angry again. Is he going to label the European Central Bank a currency manipulator? And you can start to see that we move from a trade war to a currency war to a technology war, and these are all really negative things for the global economy, things that we're very worried about. It's not all doom and gloom, though. If you're thinking about that trade war, I mentioned those American companies and other companies that might come out of China. Well, somebody's going to benefit from all of that. And it's very clear that Vietnam is one of the biggest beneficiaries of all of this. Vietnam's been a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's a one-party communist state, but it's very clearly directing or demonstrating the way that it wants to go. It wants to liberalize. It wants to open up. It wants to be part of the global economy, and it's benefiting from all of that. We see a big outflow of manufacturing, foreign direct investment from China into Vietnam and other countries coming in there as well, which is great, which means that the Vietnamese economy is booming. It's growing about just under 7% or so, we think, over the next few years. But because of this big increase in exports to the United States, sooner or later, Vietnam's going to come up onto the radar of President Trump, and that's not a nice place to be. Okay, so talked a little bit about big-ticket issues, talked a little bit about risks that we see to the global economy. Let's come on then to the sort of to the main course, which is our economic forecasts. I've got a friend in the office who is a bit geeky when it comes to economics and geography and so on. He put this chart together, which represents the global economy. So good luck if you can sort of work out all the country names, but that's Japan in there, for example. That's Great Britain in here. And we think the global economy this year is going to grow at something like 2.3%, which, okay, that sounds okay, but this is the lowest level of growth that we've seen for 11 years. Since, again, the global financial crisis. It slows down from, about 2.8% last year. And so this is another deceleration that we're seeing. Where you see economies in the red, these are economies that are growing below that average growth rate for the global economy. Where you see them in the blue and the darker blues, these are the higher growth economies. And let me just put a bit more detail on all of this. So, sorry, I think we've lost the screen there. Okay, if we go back, if we look at places like China, China's still a high growth economy. It will be growing at over 6% this year, but it's certainly slowing down. It's not the 8, 9, 10, 11% growth that we've seen in earlier years. Brexit has been hitting confidence in the United Kingdom. People are not investing. Are we going to be in Europe or not? Should we be taking on more people or not? And people are not investing. The economy is slowing down. The United States has been growing very strongly over the past, 7 or 8 years or so. In fact, it's one of the best performing advanced industrialized economies, but it's certainly slowing down now. And we think it's going to face a significant slowdown in 2020 as well. Part of that is domestic, part of that is headwinds from the global economy. And you can look at other economies around the world to get a sense of what's going on. Europe is not in a great place at the moment. The German economy, one of the engines of the European economy, has been slowing. Manufacturing, in particular, has taken a real nosedive. You could think about the auto sector. This is a global issue, and all the supply chain around that. Interestingly, in most of those economies, private consumption is still pretty strong. I mentioned earlier on that unemployment in many advanced economies, like the United States, is at multi-year lows, which should mean that interest rates should be much higher. Inflation should be coming up. But it's not the case. And for economists, that's an interesting question. Why is that? So it's certainly the case that consumers are still spending money. Their real incomes are going up because inflation is very low. But economic growth is starting to slow down. Let me just move on to our forecasts for next year then. So where you see the arrows, the green arrows going up, these are economies that we think will be doing better next year than this year. And conversely, where you see the reds, these are economies that will be slowing. So the big one to note out is the United States, we think will slow significantly from about the 2.8% growth it was posting just last year. Japan will be barely growing in 2020. Largely that's because of the sales tax hike that we saw in October of this year. Every time you put the sales tax up, it's now at 10% in Japan, the economy tends to slow down quite dramatically. And this is an economy that anyway is lucky to post 1% year growth. It's an economy with an aging and shrinking population. So 1% growth, actually, when your population is getting smaller, is very good. Per capita, everybody's getting richer. And you should know that Japan is a rich consumer society. So, that's not, on a global scale, doesn't look very good for Japan. Well, it's okay. ASEAN I'll come on to in a moment. India is another economy, actually, that we think will pick up quite dramatically next year. We downgraded our growth outlook for India 2 or 3 times this year. President Modi has really sort of run into the sand in his reform program and so on. There's some big problems with the banking sector and so on, which means that the Indian economy has slowed down from where it really should be, 6.5%-7% growth. We think it would be lucky to grow at about 5.5% this year, but next year should be picking up. And if I go on, a little bit further out, so our forecasts sort of go out for 5 years. So if we're looking out to that average growth period, it's a much better story. We think the global economy picks up to something like an average of 2.8% growth, which is, okay, it's not stellar, but it's positive growth. And pretty much across the board, we see a return to growth in all of those economies. It's only China that we think will continue to slow. 2020 is an important year for China. The Chinese government has a stated aim of doubling GDP from where it was in 2010 by 2020. And they'll probably do that. They need to maintain growth of 6% this year and 6% next year. But all of that comes at a cost. Debt has been building up in China, and we think that after 2020, the Chinese government will make moves to deal with some of those pressures that are built up in the economy, and therefore that will continue to slow growth. But that's still 5% growth with 1.2 billion people, the second largest economy in the world. So this is still a positive story, but China is changing and transforming, we think, for the better, away from that investment-led model of growth that we've seen in recent years and towards a more sustainable model of consumer-led growth within that economy. Just coming on to ASEAN in a bit more depth and detail then. So again, where you see the figures and the arrows, this is change on the previous year. So this year isn't going to be great for ASEAN. One of its lowest sort of growth periods, we think sort of average of 4.3% growth all around. We've already seen the challenges in places like Singapore, where growth has slowed dramatically, oil and gas, trade and so on, weighing down. Malaysia, Thailand is one of the sort of disappointing stories, I guess, within Southeast Asia. Even though we've had the election return sort of to a democratically elected parliament and so on, growth really hasn't returned to that economy as you might expect. And it's in a very high-performing neighborhood, right? You've got places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, even Malaysia, which is approaching that high-income status economy, so should be growing slower, is growing much faster than Thailand. So that's a policy issue there. Places like the Philippines, 5% growth is pretty good, but it's not the 7% growth that it could be growing at, or that the government wants the economy to be growing at. You need to be looking at things like infrastructure and the real sort of bottlenecks that we have in those economies. If I go on then to the sort of, here we go, to 2020, you'll see a couple of the arrows have changed. And let's not get too concerned about Vietnam growing a little bit slower than it is this year or the year before. That's still 90-something million people growing at 6.5%, attracting a lot of foreign direct investment. It's a high growth economy. You do not see these type of growth rates in other parts of the world as well. So this part of the world remains its preeminent position as the most dynamic economically part of the world. And let me just sort of wrap up and finish to put a few more positive thoughts on there. I've been talking about all the doom and gloom, all the risk, the geopolitical uncertainty, and so on, which is great for us because everybody wants to know all about it, but maybe not such an uplifting story. But let me change tack a little bit then to think about sort of going forward for this part of the world, particularly for Southeast Asia, I think. We have continued solid growth, and that's not going away. In most of the economies, we have very favorable demographics, young populations that are growing rapidly. And traditionally, young populations that are growing, throw some capital, some investment technology, and you get strong economic growth. You could be thinking about urbanization, one of the most important and exciting developments that's taking place in Asia as a whole, so including places like India and China, but particularly here in Southeast Asia. We've done lots of studies looking at how Asian cities will look in 2030, for example. Massive inflow of people coming in, a massive demand for infrastructure, for commercial property, residential property, and the people who live in those dense urban areas tend to be quite well off, particularly compared to their sort of rural cousins. So you then think about all the products and services that these people are going to be demanding as they get richer. And as, for you guys, thinking about tourism, these are people for the first time with that level of disposable income who are looking to go overseas. I spent a long time in Japan, and one of the most successful stories we've seen there has been that boom in tourism over the past 10 years or so. And this is one sort of government target that the government beats every year. The market is well ahead of the government here. Fantastic growth story. As that emerging middle class comes out, they want to travel, they want to spend money, they want good food, good experiences, whatever. Japan has been right in the best place for that. Anyway, urbanization, you could be thinking about the amount of money that's being spent on infrastructure within the region and more broadly around connectivity, thinking about those platform economies, smartphones, the 5G systems that will be coming in the next few years. We could be thinking about, yes, that rapid adoption of technology and the growing affluence. These are all in the post. These are all drivers of growth, particularly here within Southeast Asia and to greater or lesser degrees around the region as well. Should also mention some challenges and opportunities to deal with. So, along with the growing affluence is inequality, something that we need to be aware of and start dealing with. We could be thinking about the aging demographic profile of Japan, or Singapore, or South Korea, or Hong Kong, and many other economies not far behind. But again, that's an opportunity if you look at it in the right way. Coming up with the right products and services for an increasingly aged but rich, affluent part of society, that's where some people should be thinking. We could be thinking about the digital divide, whether people in the islands of Indonesia actually have access to that digital economy that we keep talking about. Are we spending enough on infrastructure and are we spending fast enough as well? But I talked about those bottlenecks in Indonesia, for example. So I think I'll leave you with that. Security issues, let's skip over that one because that's not so fun. But anyway, these are some of the fundamental drivers that we see. Altogether then, if I should sort of summarize that, there's a lot of challenges with the global economy. A lot of it is politics. A lot of it is backlash to globalization, populism, nationalism, and so on. From our perspective at The Economist, we would be arguing for more people coming together, more people finding ways to work out their problems through multilateral institutions like the WTO. Because if we know anything, we know that globalization has been incredibly successful for this part of the world, and it creates all sorts of opportunities for people and for economies to grow. I'm going to finish there. I think Robin and I can then get into a bit of a conversation, and very happy to take any questions that you might have. Robin.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for the reality check. And I suppose at the end of this session, you will have a different view of what the future is going to look like. And maybe you and I will play a role in shaping it. And come, Andrew, that's something that we need to spend a bit of time. And one of the things which I'm very curious is that you speak a lot in other industries. And obviously in the travel industry, we've heard a lot of speakers, we've heard a lot of reviews. And one of the things which I'm always very keen about is you spoke in insurance business, which obviously are impacted by all these events around the world. How does all this other industry cope with these massive changes, and now what lessons can we learn from this other industry so that we have a different perspective, and your view will be invaluable to us?
So I think the most important thing is that they take out a subscription with The Economist.
Yeah, I knew that was coming.
But no, more importantly, I mean, he talked about the insurance industry, for example, or reinsurance is a conference I've been speaking at last few weeks. They are massively concerned with the state of the global economy. Where's the inflation? Why do we have zero interest rates in Japan or negative interest rates in Japan and with the European Central Bank? Because they can't make money. And there's negative yielding bonds that go out, 30-year bonds. It's a very, very strange situation for them to be in. For people like manufacturing here within Asia, it's all about the trade war. It's all about how much of my value chain is exposed to all of that. What decisions do I need to make about moving things around? For other players, let's say in technology, in e-commerce, it's much more that last slide. Wow, we share that sort of vision of growth within the region. How can we position? What capabilities do we need to build? Where do we need to build the investments? How can we find the people that we're going to need to power all of that growth?
Right. I think that's very motivating because, often when you are in your own comfort zone of your own business, you kind of look inward and you continue to hear the same results. But I think learning from other industry will be a very important part. Now, what we want to do, it's Soon Hwa is going to be playing the roving person that if you have a burning question, please do so. But at this juncture, I'd like to pick up one question that was related to what you said earlier about this trade war influencing the monetary policies and so on. But I suppose if you look at what would then impact us as an industry, will countries begin to use travel as a retaliatory weapons in kind of restricting visa to specific countries as a result of this trade war? You think that will develop to that stage? So
let me answer that in sort of two stages. And 10 years ago, you would say, no, business, investment, travel, tourism are separate things. Certainly China has taken the lead in weaponizing tourism. We've seen that with South Korea a few years ago. We see that more recently with Japan and elsewhere as well. And this speaks to a bigger concern about the politicization of business. Think about Cathay Pacific. Think about Huawei. These are all businesses that are being sucked into that political debate between two major powers. And they don't want to be there at all. They just want to get on and do business. To the specific question about will we see more countries use visa restrictions as a sort of extension of the trade war, we think not. We certainly think that there's probably some evidence of people, Chinese nationals, finding it a little bit more difficult to get into the United States, but China itself hasn't used that switch that it has used previously with Japan, South Korea, even with places like Australia and New Zealand. So not at the moment, as far as we see.
Well, that's very comforting, but on the more positive note, I think there were some questions in between, and I kind of picked up one of those questions up there, is that in the travel industry and tourism industry, while navigating all this global turbulence, do you think it will result, because in previously all the done deals, it's all good, everything is done deals, so people probably travel a little bit less. You can, people have been telling us that, well, we don't have to travel to a place to get a deal. You can go through visual interviews, you can go internet, you can go email. But in the light of this uncertainty, do you think that it will promote more travel in the sense that because it's a new world order and new people are in charge, do you think that will promote travel as a result of this global mess?
Good question. You would hope so. You would hope that more people are interested in getting out and finding out more about the world. Just sort of tangentially, last week here in Singapore, we had a session with our members looking at the development of global leaders. The idea that you have fantastic managers, in your Chinese operations who've dealt with complexity, agility, innovation, massively fast-moving economies, and so on. And then, how do you share that experience? Is it through virtual teams and, the internet and all the rest of it? Well, yes, you can do a bit of that, but it really doesn't compensate for going to Vietnam or for China and really seeing, wow, this is an economy growing at 6-7% or so. This is what a high growth economy. The experience of that is so rich and so valuable in the business world. That's something that I think senior leadership are increasingly waking up to.
Well, I think that's a bit of good news. I think we certainly hope that will result from people travel a lot more to find new business partners and in a new world order. At this juncture, is there any questions on the floor that you would like to ask Andrew for his views? I think that would be quite useful because it's not very often that you manage to get this. I don't think he's asleep at all, so it's very difficult to get him, and we're so delighted that he's here with us. So don't miss this opportunity if you have a burning questions. I know there are some of them already posted there, but something that you would like to be engaged. This is an engagement series, and I hope that perhaps you may have a view or two about what Andrew has spoken.
If there's somebody marshalling their thoughts at the moment, maybe I could take this one on the US-China trade war.
Yeah, that would be good.
Question earlier on. So look, this is something that's emerged over the past couple of years, and over that period, the tariffs have been implemented by China or the United States. Has been a tit-for-tat retaliation. By the end of this year, by middle of December, virtually all US-China trade, 98% of it, will be covered by tariffs of up to 25%. And think about that for a moment. This is the world's number one, the world's number two economies that are weighed down by these massive tariffs. That's one of the reasons why global growth is so. Now, there's a lot of discussion about, is there going to be a trade deal with China? We supposedly got an agreement between those two powers, the US and China, on a phase one deal. And there was speculation that President Trump and Xi Jinping would sign this month in Chile, where the OECD was going to have a meeting. That's now been shelved. So there's talk that this is going to take place over the next 2 or 3 weeks in the United States. However, this isn't something that's going to end the war. This means that some of the tariffs that would go on in October and December have been suspended. But the ones that are already there will remain there. And we'll also then need to have a phase two, which is much more difficult. Phase one is talking about China buy some more soybeans and so on. Phase two is all about America wants China to change the way its economy is structured. Intellectual property rights, support for state-owned energy. This is very, very difficult for China to agree to. So we think that there might be a deal between the United States and China. It will be quite shallow, and it will also be quite brittle. And there's absolutely nothing to suggest that the fundamental drivers of this trade war, i.e. battle for supremacy between these two economies, that's not going to go away anytime soon.
Okay, now I've just been alerted. We have 5 more minutes. Is there any questions on the floor that you'd like to direct your question? Or if not, we can pick it up from there. I think for a change, let's have something different on climate change. Yep. Yeah, I think that would be quite interesting.
Yep, climate change is a great one. So look, we publish our economic forecast. We look at everything that's going on, the population, investment, government spending, all the rest of it. One thing that from the beginning of this year that we started to include is how prepared economies are for climate change. And you see great varieties in all of this. But more importantly for us, our long-range forecast looks out to 2050, and that's the type of time frame you could be thinking of for climate change and rising sea levels and so on. So how prepared are economies for that? How well positioned are they to deal with some of the challenges? Good example of Singapore and Indonesia. So we had the Prime Minister here just a couple of months ago talking about the need for Singapore to be spending $100 billion on preparing for climate change, particularly seawall defences and so on. We know that Changi Airport is being built, 5 meters above sea levels and things like this. And then we had President Jokowi in Indonesia saying Jakarta's sinking. It's sinking in some places at 25 centimeters a year because of taking groundwater out and very low lying anyway. Nothing we can do about it. We're going to move the capital to Borneo. So those are two very different reactions to climate change. But of course, Singapore is rich and it can afford to do all of that. Indonesia is a developing economy, a fast developing economy, but still a developing economy. The hit to the Singaporean economy will be much less than it is in Indonesia.
Right. Now, heading towards the end of the discussion and the conversation, I suppose there's a lot of questions there, and we could take that offline after the event. But the last, I suppose this is what, probably speaking on behalf of the audience, what will be your advice? Having view all of this will impact the tourism industry for all of us. I know it's a big order, but
honestly, I would say you're in a really good sector. If you look at those drivers of growth, emerging economies, if you look at the growing affluence, if you look at the technology, you look at so when we did some research with the Economist, and there's a sort of band of people that we identified around the world called the globally curious. People who are interested in what's going on in the global economy, want to learn more about it. And I think you'll find that strata of people gets bigger and bigger as economies grow, as people learn more about other economies, other countries, nations, and the opportunities to travel there. So I gave the example of Japan earlier on, but just look at the tourism coming into mainland Southeast Asia and everywhere else as well. So if I was talking to people in the oil and gas industry, they know that their sector needs to dramatically change. They need to be thinking about climate change, carbon, switching to a carbon-free economy, and so on. And many of them are very, very worried about that future. But if I look out, particularly here within the region, at those underlying drivers of growth, then you guys are very well positioned, so invest more.
That's very comforting, Andrew. Thank you very much. And now that we've finished the first session, perhaps we should now test the temperature. And the first time when we had the first question, there was some very serious thought about serious impact. Perhaps after hearing the reassuring and overview of what the word is, still serious impact, so now even more serious. Andrew, you're frightening F. Okay, so let's look at the first question. You've got 4 persons, very concerned. We have minimum, moderate, 55%. And I think that's very interesting because after you have an overview of what those trade numbers, those growth in 2020 likely to be, and the reassurance from Andrew that we are in a good industry to capitalize on some of those trade wars, and we might see some change in terms of what's in your mind now. I think the moderate impact is still there. Glad to know that the temperature has kind of cooled down a little bit. You're not as concerned as you walked in. Okay, so we will just stop at 63 because I think that's what. Let's bring up. So later on, you can have these numbers. Let's bring up the second question. You saw the economic growth forecast. How do you expect 2020 to be compared to 2019? So it's good to see that much more challenging, despite the fact that we're going to see some opportunities ahead. Okay.
I think people must be in budget setting times.
Yeah, I know.
So
now we're in a budget mode, so we better be conservative in our budget before our bosses get too carried away,
I think one thing I would say about the trade war is that this is a new reality that we're in, and get used to it. It's not a shock anymore. As the politicization of businesses, these are all new things that we need to be taking into account as we look at our sort of growth strategies and so on. So don't expect it to go away. It will be there in the background and just adapt to it.
Right, so I think we've come to the end of this first session. Thank you very much, Andrew, for taking your time. Deeply appreciate your time, and I hope that you will stay and interact, and perhaps there are some who would like to know. But more importantly, read those publications, The Economist, because that gives you the comfort of how to predict what the future is going to be like. Because when you read too many, you get confused. You read one, then you know that you have a focused view. And more importantly, when your bosses read the same magazine, you are in sync with your boss's thinking. So you're quite safe. So Andrew, please send the subscription there. Perhaps during the next networking, we will have more. I think one of the things that we really in the travel industry need to do is step out and communicate and discuss more. Because then you know, what I really love is to go and attend those oil and gas, insurance, education. At least I know what they are thinking. So it kind of fit into my overall. If we talk among ourselves all the time, you'll be scratching each other's back and feel shocked. Then you don't know where the pains, joints are. So I think it's quite important. Thank you, Andrew, very much.